I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian, and welcome to this edition of the Extra Podcast. I'm pleased to welcome back Ronnie Ramos, the relatively new executive editor of the Daily Memphian, to talk about news coverage in the time of COVID-19, the recession that's following the pandemic, as well as, of course, the protests and how we've covered that, as well as some changes, some really cool and interesting staff changes we're in the midst of making. Ronnie, thanks for joining me.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I mean, I think we will. I guess we did this. Maybe you were a month in, 2-3 weeks in, just partly just to introduce you. For those who didn't hear that or haven't noticed that you've come on, and there's been so much going on with Daily Memphian, they may not have. But you came to us from the Indy Star in early January. You were executive editor up there, and you've had a long and storied career. What started at the Miami Herald, you were in Shreveport, you were in Atlanta. Yeah, Atlanta. So it seems like you and I talk about 19 times a day, give or take. And it does seem like you've been here almost from the beginning, but let's talk a little bit. You came in and then boom, mid-March, the city began, the world began to shut down, the US did. Let's start with COVID-19 and how the approach to that, and I don't even know where to start really, but one of the main things that people probably noticed was that we made our COVID-19, our coronavirus coverage free. And I remember you and I talking about that. We went about a day and we didn't make it free. We didn't put it outside the paywall. And there was some moment, I feel like, where you turned to me, because this was before we had started social distancing, and you said, we need to make it free. We're screwing up. And we made it free. Do you remember that moment?
Yeah, I think it was like a Monday morning, because if I remember, they started shutting down the city on a Friday when the restaurants started closing down. And so we had that weekend of everybody just trying to figure out what does closing down really mean and how we're going to deal with it. And then we sort of kept doing things the way we're doing, and we really realized swiftly that we needed to sort of do this from a different level, both from a coverage standpoint, but then also on an access standpoint.
Right. It's kind of emblematic of, I think, everyone in their personal lives, in governmentally, businesses, everyone, particularly in March, which seems like 100 years ago, everyone felt a little bit behind, right? You sort of felt like, wait, what is going on? Wait, we've known about coronavirus in China for months. Now it's coming here. Like there was a sense of being a step behind, which for me, watching our coverage, and I get way too much credit for our coverage. Really, the credit goes first of all to the newsroom and the people who do it, and then to you and the other editors. But then we caught our breath, and I think we did. I don't want to just self-celebrate here, but we did some really amazing coverage. Talk about how you had to kind of retool the newsroom. Sports ended real quickly. We have 5 sports writers and a sports editor. Talk about how you had to shift things internally to try to catch the breadth of what was going on.
Sure. I mean, and I think too, there's some buildup, because I think the first case was like March 4th, and things really shut down in Memphis on the 22nd, and some other cities were before and after, but we were sort of reacting to what was happening here, since we're obviously a local news site. And then the challenge became really in the second half of March, excuse me, and into April, is what do we do to cover this, because it really was an all-consuming thing. And so sports stopped literally almost overnight. And so we're fortunate in that Jeff Calkins, who's our sports columnist, is very experienced, and he shifted over and started doing news columns about the issues. People like Drew Hill came over and started doing news as well. So you sort of redeployed the sports people to do some news. The other big thing that we did relatively fast, and we did it probably before most other sites around the country, was we went to a live blog where we could update people in real time on a bunch of stories, because a lot of things were happening on a lot of fronts, and you couldn't just sort of become, from a reader perspective, I thought, be very difficult to follow all along. So if we can put it in one place and update it in one place, that turned out to be very helpful. And so we had to dedicate somebody full time to do that.
Yeah,
because there were so many updates.
Yeah, and not always, but primarily, I believe that was Elle Perry. People are familiar
Correct.
with Elle doing neighborhood coverage, some arts and culture coverage. Her byline kind of disappeared, and I actually think and maybe I was sort of wondering like, where did Elle go? And then you told me, reminded me that no, she's there in force and doing a great job. You mentioned Drew. Drew did what for me was one of the most powerful COVID-19 related stories, which was the kind of living wake that Sarl, the woman who's run
The yoga
since
instructor.
passed, yeah, who the Midtown Yoga and married to Jimmy Lewis, people in Memphis know them, and it was just the most amazing story that Drew did, and I don't mean this as an insult to Drew. I think it's really a compliment. I had numerous people come to me and say, I read that story and it was just so powerful and so sort of beautiful about her living wake. And if people didn't read it, her friends and family, because they couldn't get together, they did kind of a drive-by wave and chat, and he captured it so well. And I had a number of people say, I thought it was a Jeff Calkins story. I kept going back to the top thinking that, well, no, this is Jeff. Jeff must have written this, because Jeff has done so many of those,
Right.
whether it's on sports or non-sports, over the decades he's covered Memphis. And there's Drew, who's what? He's 2 years out of J school, right?
He's probably 3 or 4, yeah.
3 or 4 years out of J school. So that was amazing. Elle doing I mean, I don't want to, Linda Moore ran the kindness blog, which was a really nice thing that y'all started, that we started.
And to her credit, she volunteered that. And, one quick little story, which was interesting, is I had to do this one other time before when I was one of the assistant city editors at the Miami Herald. Hurricane Andrew went through town and destroyed much of South Florida, and sports stopped. And this was before the internet, but you had all these stories to cover. And I said, well, why don't we use the sports writers? And the news people were like, do you think they could do it? Are they fast enough? I'm like, are you kidding? You know how much time they have to write on deadline after a game? And the writers would go out at 9 a.m, turn in a story at noon and say, what else do you want? And these editors are like, what do you mean you're done already? I go, well, you told me to get it done as fast as possible. It's done here.
Yeah.
So I've always known that, sports writers, while they seem like they're just having fun and covering games, they really work under very excruciating deadlines. They did for print. And so it's really translated well for digital because they know how to get things done fast and can report. And, at the end of the day, it's talking to people. And
Yeah.
I think you saw that with Drew's story is really about just talking to people. And he did a really good job of capturing that whole scene.
One thing I had the experience again, because I mean, some days I'm involved, but I'm not involved in the minute to minute, hour to hour by any stretch of what happens with our coverage, which you obviously know. But some people, they just kind of perceive me as being more involved in that stuff. So I had I often have the experience that a reader has of just opening up the site and seeing it and not knowing what to see, what's going to be there. And there was the live stream in HD of the mayor of the Shelby Memphis task force. And I thought, oh, wow, we've done something new. Like, we were streaming it live on the homepage. We'd embedded video before. We'd embedded some live streaming a handful of times, but that became a regular feature, which was hugely beneficial. And obviously, because we can see the numbers and the traffic in terms of what people wanted to see and the feedback we get. What do you think some of the biggest challenges, though? And I mean, I know some of it, the challenges around bringing context in such a fast moving and uncertain story, like for instance, just the case rate. The case rate's coming out. Some days it looked like a big scary number because X 100 more, 150 more, whatever the number was, have tested positive. Making sense and giving context to that overwhelming amount of information, different models. Are we following the University of Washington model? Are we following the Vanderbilt model? Talk about that challenge.
Yeah, so you're sort of like, the best way I can describe it is you're running a bunch of trains on parallel tracks, and you have to cover what's happening in real time. And we did that with the blogs, and then with the kindness blog, as you mentioned, which is actually, for people that like inside baseball, was the Jeff Calkins idea.
Oh, and wow. I didn't know that.
I go, that's really a smart idea. We should do that. And Linda said, well, I'll volunteer and host it. And so it really was a pretty cool organic thing that just sort of happened. So you have all these things happening as they do, and you got the daily numbers being released. And then the problem becomes, you need to start a second train, which is providing some context around all of this information. And the numbers is a really good example, because we were doing a good job of getting all the numbers, and it became this issue that we weren't getting enough of the numbers that we wanted. The state, the county health department, for example, was not releasing how many hospital beds were being used and how many people were hospitalized. Data that really was crucial to deciding how bad things were. And so we had to write stories about that. And then once they released them, it's like, okay, what do we do with it? And so we really took Omar Youssef, who's covers one of the neighborhoods, and says, you're going to be on the explaining the numbers beat for the next couple of weeks. And every day when the numbers came out, he would report and write about what they mean and compare them, so we could do exactly what you said, to have some context around what do these numbers mean, and what does it mean mostly for Memphis too, because one of the big issues is Memphis was making its decision, which could be different from what Tennessee was doing, which is different from what the national government or the president may say, or it might be the same. And so you sort of had to wade through all those issues. And so one of our challenges was, how can we give people a place where they can come and digest the numbers and compare them and get some context so they can see what's happening over time.
Yeah. Another challenge, and this is not uncommon, but I've said this before to people, and who maybe are news followers or even news junkies, but they've never worked in a newsroom or worked, in a media company, that you do have the challenge with reporters that reporters are, and I think all of our reporters are really good at what they do, but they aren't epidemiologists. They aren't infectious disease experts, right? They're not scientists. And that isn't even remotely a regular beat, right? So if you have somebody who covers business, like Wayne Risher covers FedEx and has for many, many years, he knows a lot about FedEx and its finances, and knows how to, look at the earnings statements and listen to the earnings calls and make sense of that. We didn't have anybody, nor should we have, who understood, on a scientific level, the coronavirus outbreak, and again, an outbreak that had so much uncertainty from the national, international, local level. So talk about that challenge.
Well, and that's one of the challenges of journalism is you need people to, on one level, you create beats, and you have people like Wayne that you mentioned, who develop an expertise in an area. And part of the advantage of that is you get to get stories before other people and understand trends and be able to be much more authoritative. And then you have something like this happen, and people just really need to learn on the fly and learn enough to be able to ask the right questions and find the right people. So it really became more of who has the answers and who can provide insight, and how can we get to them. And that, because like you said, we don't have, a doctor who's
on staff,
on the staff,
Right. And I thought James,
Jeff Calkins is a lawyer, so we may be able to get some legal things from him once in a while. But
I'm not going to Jeff for legal advice. No offense, Jeff. If I need to work on a column or understand sports or many other things, I will go to Jeff. But and Jane Roberts, who had, I believe, the healthcare beat before we started. She did a really good job talking to the hospitals and sort of pulling things in. But you think of like Bill Dries, who's covered the city and politics and government forever, but suddenly government officials are talking about these scientific issues. So he's trying to make sense of it. It's just Peggy Birch, who does our op-eds and guest columns, trying to get some of these epidemiologists and experts to come in and comment on it. But it's overwhelming. Right? It was nonstop. The traffic was double. I think you and I both have mentioned this in columns we've done, that the traffic exploded. People had so many questions, so many concerns, differing opinions. It was, to say the least, difficult. Again, you mentioned Hurricane Andrew. Is that the closest for you in your many years doing this?
In terms of impact on a community and just the time length involved. 9/11 was very impactful, but it was very. I'm not trying to be dismissive, but it was a very short window of events that happened around it, and it was much more of a national thing than a local. I was in Fort Myers at the time, and it really didn't have people can empathize and stuff, but it didn't have the impact on the community that like Andrew did. on Miami or this
Yeah.
did on every community. I mean, this is,
Right.
it's also different from Andrew because it's really a shared experience. You can have a conversation with my daughter in New York and understand, and you're both experiencing the same quarantine and
Yeah.
issues and uncertainty. So it's a very unique event in that there's a lot of shared experiences around it, and and somehow that made the coverage easier and harder. You didn't have to explain as much, but you had a lot more to cover. The range of stuff that you had to cover was much more because everything was impacted.
Yeah.
Our Jennifer Biggs, our restaurant writer, say, well, she's out of a job because there's no restaurants open. Well, she really had a lot of work to do because it was all about when do they reopen and how, and what does that look like, and what's the impact, and
Yeah.
supply lines. And one of the big reasons we got advance warning that we're going to reopen is because restaurant owners needed time to be able to prepare.
Yeah.
So it just impacted everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me take a quick break just to remind everyone that this podcast is brought to you by FedEx, what we deliver by delivering. Also note, the Extra Podcast is one of many weekly podcasts we do here at the Daily Memphian, including the Behind the Headlines podcast, as well as shows on politics. Bill Dries does a politics podcast. Jennifer Biggs, as you mentioned, she does a food podcast every week. We are beginning to get back to sports podcasts, which we'll actually talk about in just a second. All of our podcasts are on the Daily Memphian site. They're on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's we talk about the COVID coverage all day, obviously, but I want to segue into, we went from that into, and maybe, as people smarter than me have pointed out, maybe not coincidentally, into this, what is another national story with unique local impact and nuanced impact from community to community, which is the protest following the George Floyd killing by police in Minneapolis. We have, one inside baseball thing that I'm just kind of curious about, or I think people do, if they're listening to this and they're kind of interested in how news works. How many people on a given night would we have, I know the answer to this, but I'm being coy, would we have out covering the protests? I mean, it varied, I know, by night, but sometimes we had.
Up until through Saturday night, we had either 5 or 6 people out on the scene, and another 1, 2, 3 to 4 people in our virtual office, for lack of a better word, because we're working remotely, but online handling it. So it was 10 people for the length of the protest.
Yeah.
And a staff of 35. So you're talking about a third of your staff every night we did it, I think, 9 nights in a week, 9 nights in a row.
Yeah.
So it's a, we learned some things from the coronavirus, like the ability to embed live. And so we literally had one person live streaming for 2 hours, walking the protest route with the protesters and interviewing and providing, for lack of a better word, play by play, telling people what's happening. And, and that did very well for us. But then you also have people there reporting, interviewing people, and sending back, information in real time. And then again, Elle was on a couple of nights, most of the nights she was running a live blog so people could follow along with what was happening. Yeah. Especially at the beginning, there was a lot of violence around the country. And so the question became, what would happen here? And I think Memphis really became a unique story in many ways because it was large numbers of protesters, but there really wasn't the widespread looting and vandalism that we've seen in other cities.
Yeah. How with a story like that do you maintain, and it's an ongoing story, right? I mean, the protests have kind of slowed down, but the issues behind all this don't go away. I mean, we did a story, as you and I taped this on Tuesday. Last night we had a story challenging, the city mayor's office, police department about releasing information about the any use of force, any charges against them, just anything about use of force by police on individuals. We have not been able to get that information from the city so far, which was part of the story. It's an ongoing story, is my point. How do you maintain objectivity in this around issues of race and equity and equality? Because it's complicated.
It is, and I think what we've strived to do, and what I've urged my editors and reporters is to focus on being inclusive. And what I mean by that is making sure that we get different perspectives and voices in the stories as much as possible. So whether it's a good example was Saturday, there was a small protest, small meaning in terms of numbers, in Collierville, and Abigail Warren was there, who's done a great job. She's done everything from report stories to live broadcasts to chase down things. And she was there, and she talked to, there were both two sides of the protesters. So she talked to both sides and got their perspective. And now, one side is not happy with everything that was or wasn't included. So it becomes difficult because you can't get everything. And frankly, to be candid, we're battling an age where people equate their perspective with news. In other words, if they're looking for, if they believe A, they want stories that line up with A. And our job is to say, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what people think on one side. Here's what people think on the other side. And so we're not always going to be leaning 100% to one side or another. And if we did, I think there'd be some issues with our story. And the police brutality one is a very good example. We want to cover the protests. We want to say, here's what happened. Here's whether there was violence or not. Here's what they're arguing for. Here's what they're demanding. And then when the mayor comes out like he did and gives a very passionate speech, we cover that. But then the question then becomes, okay, so now what? And so that's why we asked for the records. It wasn't to go after the police, but to assess. So how many cases are there here? How were they resolved? Is there an officer that has 18 complaints against them or her? I don't know, but I think the public should know what's the scope of the issue here. And it may be better or more or less or worse than other places. And then we become, which I think is one of our challenges and one of the things we've really are trying to do at the Daily Memphian, which is, okay, so then what are the solutions? And not just sort of say, hey, here's a problem, but then let's expand on it and move the conversation forward and talk to the people on all sides about what are possible solutions and how can we get at resolving this issue. It's not good enough to just sort of say there's a problem.
Yeah. We're getting close to going long. I could talk about this more. Did we ever worried about safety of journalists out in the protest?
Yes, and I sent a note out to all the staff that said that if at any point any reporter or photographer, because we, like I said, we had 5 or 6 people there, feel unsafe, that they should get out. Yeah. And if that means we don't get certain stories, then that's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to have people need to be able to protect themselves. I've covered riots in Miami, and you get shot at and you get out. I mean, there's only so much that you can do. So it never got to that point, but it's something you got to talk to your staff about ahead of time, because you don't want there to be any ambiguity. And the thing is, these reporters are so dedicated to what they're doing that they will, they're all in. Yeah. And so sometimes, you got to remind them that, you got to take care of yourselves.
With just a few minutes left, we've mentioned a few things. I think you wrote a column about just some evolution in the staff, some changes in the staff, where we talk about neighborhoods and suburban and education coverage. Well,
I think one of our challenges, as you come out of these things, is to pause and say, where do we go from here? Where do we need to do? And one of the big things is, I think we need to do a better job in 3 areas of neighborhoods, suburban coverage, and then also education or schools, and not so much covering school board meetings, but really talking about the issues in schools when they come back. What does it look like? The things that resonate with parents that are, sending their kids to schools. And so, in moving some staff around, we're really lucky that we had a senior editor, Clay Bailey, who is sort of still sports editor, but is going to be a senior editor for neighborhoods. And he has decades of experience doing this, is very passionate about it. And I think he'll really help elevate our coverage in that area.
And that'll include Abigail, who people who read our Collierville, Germantown coverage, she'll continue to do that. Michael Waddell, who's actually a freelancer for us, covers Bartlett and Arlington. And then Linda Moore, who's been covering the county for us, but is going to shift over and cover education for us. Do I have that correct?
Right. And Omar Youssef will cover neighborhoods. And we may shuffle around who covers what neighborhoods. But the idea is really to embed them in those communities and be able to tell the stories of those communities and those people. And I think that will help us get better and bring home more important local journalism.
Right. We'll shift to sports because there's some changes there. Drew Hill will be our full-time Grizzlies beat writer. Grizzlies are reopening soon. The first question I've already gotten, and Drew came to us, I don't know, I have no sense of time anymore, but give or take a year ago to cover the Tigers. He shifted over to the Grizzlies job, which he really wanted. What's going on with Chris Harrington?
He'll continue to be Chris, which is to say he's very good at a lot of different things. He's going to write some more columns across the sort of the Memphis landscape, and he'll also do his occasional analysis of the Grizzlies. And if this were normal times and say the Grizzlies made the playoffs, and he probably would shift into Grizzlies coverage to augment that coverage during the playoffs because there'll be a lot more interest. So people may or may not know, but when they resume the NBA season, it'll be in Orlando at Disney World complex, and they're going to keep everybody there. So it's going to be a different challenge on how to cover them.
Yeah.
But Chris will continue to be multi-dimensional and do a bunch of different things.
Right. In some ways, I think for people who've, I've read and followed and known Chris for quite some time now, 10, 20 years, I don't know, 15 years. He's kind of getting back to a role that it was before you came to Memphis, obviously, but that he used to have, where he was going, he's not going to be doing the 901 like he used to do at the Commercial Appeal, but more kind of commentary like that, then into arts and culture, and then into basketball, and then sometimes all three in the same column in that way that, in my mind, only Chris can really do. And then also, so we'll be hiring we're looking for a college. We're not giving up on the Tigers. We'll be having a college basketball writer.
We'll have a college basketball writer, a sports editor, and then we also are going to add an enterprise, an investigative reporter, someone that can sort of work exclusively on providing some context and digging deep into some issues around Memphis that need to be told in an effort to round out our coverage and provide some depth.
Okay. All right. That is all the time we have. I appreciate you coming in. We have a meeting anyway in like half an hour, so we got to get off this call. But a reminder, one more time, that the Extra Podcast is one of many weekly podcasts we do at the Daily Memphian, including the Behind the Headlines podcast, sports, food, or sports soon, food right now, and politics. You can get them on the Daily Memphian site, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Ronnie, thanks for joining me, and thanks all of you for listening.